For 30 years Daddy Dave built his legend on raw speed, fierce loyalty, and the rock-solid confidence of a man who feared absolutely nothing. He raced under blazing lights, walked away from crashes that should have ended his career, and stood as one of the most relentless competitors Street Outlaws has ever seen. But behind all the horsepower and bravado, he was hiding an entirely different life. And now that secret is threatening to tear down everything he fought so hard to create. The night the engine went silent, the first real fracture in Daddy Dave's carefully separated worlds didn't happen during a high-stakes race under blinding lights. It happened in the quiet aftermath, when the asphalt had cooled, the crowd had gone home, and the roar faded into something almost reverent. In early 2025, long after the last fans left and the final transporter rolled out, Dave sat alone in his trailer with his hands shaking in a way he couldn't control. The race had gone perfectly, the engine tuned to razor-sharp precision, the win clean and decisive. Yet something deep inside him felt dangerously out of alignment. For years he had mastered control in every arena that mattered, whether gripping the wheel at insane speeds or standing in front of cameras projecting unbreakable confidence. The Street Outlaws audience knew him as fearless and unbreakable, a man who survived savage wrecks and crushing losses without ever losing his edge. That image had been built carefully over decades, reinforced with grit, discipline, and a refusal to show any weakness, and he protected it the same way he protected his most valuable machine. But that night, in the dim glow of the trailer's lights, the mask slipped in a way he had never permitted before. His chest tightened suddenly, not from leftover adrenaline, but from something heavier, something he couldn't outrun. The walls seemed to press in around him, and the silence that followed victory felt louder than any engine he had ever commanded. He pressed his hand against the cold metal table to steady himself, yet the tremor in his fingers refused to stop. He had walked away from violent wrecks that left twisted metal scattered across the track. He had survived rivalries that threatened to shatter the entire racing brotherhood. This felt different, because there was no visible enemy, no external opponent to blame. A phone call shattered the fragile quiet. The voice on the other end carried no celebration, only a low, deliberate tone. "We need to talk," the caller said. Dave closed his eyes, because those words had haunted him longer than he ever admitted. He had been bracing for this moment in ways he never voiced, as though a clock had been ticking quietly behind every win and every handshake, for 30 years. Stretching back long before Street Outlaws turned him into a household name in racing culture, Daddy Dave had maintained two completely separate realities with meticulous care. One was the public legend, the devoted competitor, the loyal husband and father whose life revolved around horsepower and honor. The other existed behind locked doors, guarded schedules, and explanations that grew thinner with every passing year. He had convinced himself that separation was protection, and that compartmentalizing truth was an act of responsibility rather than deception. In recent months, though, quiet questions had started coming from people who no longer accepted vague answers or unexplained absences. Small inconsistencies that once disappeared into the chaos of racing life were now being examined with unsettling clarity. Sitting there in the dim trailer light, Dave understood that the life he had built on speed and control was about to collide with something he couldn't simply outdrive. The engine outside had gone silent. But the reckoning inside him had only just begun, and once the truth stepped out of the shadows where it had lived for 3 decades, there would be no tuning it back into silence. The king of the streets, long before television cameras captured smoke curling from his tires, Daddy Dave had already forged a reputation in the shadows of Oklahoma's back roads. Street racing wasn't just adrenaline for him, it was identity, sealed in late-night challenges and handshakes that carried more weight than any contract. By the time Street Outlaws brought national attention to that underground world, Dave was already known as a relentless competitor who raced with calculated aggression and a quiet confidence that rattled opponents before the light even dropped. The audience saw horsepower and bravado, but those closest to him understood that his composure was deliberate. He spoke carefully in interviews, avoided unnecessary drama when rivalries flared, and carried himself like a man who knew legacy mattered more than temporary victory. That discipline made him formidable. Yet it also made him guarded in ways few people questioned at the time. Crashes became part of his mythology, especially the devastating wreck that nearly ended everything and forced him to stare mortality in the face. Viewers watched him recover publicly, fighting back from injury with stubborn determination that reinforced the image of unbreakable resilience. What they didn't see was how the accident deepened his instinct to control every variable in his life, tightening the boundaries between what the world saw and what he kept hidden. In the years that followed, Dave doubled down on perfection, refining his cars with obsessive precision and managing his public persona with equal care. Success on Street Outlaws amplified the pressure to stay consistent, because fans don't fall in love with complexity. They fall in love with certainty. Dave gave them certainty, in the form of speed, loyalty, and unwavering dedication to his racing family. At home he played a parallel role with the same intensity, making sure the demands of racing never appeared to overshadow his responsibilities as a husband and father. He prided himself on balance, believing he had mastered compartmentalization so thoroughly that the two worlds would never collide in damaging ways. For a long time that belief seemed justified, yet beneath the roar of engines and the routine of filming schedules, another narrative had been unfolding quietly for decades. Long before fame, long before sponsorship deals and televised rivalries, Dave had made decisions that required secrecy to sustain. Those decisions weren't reckless in the traditional sense, but they created obligations and emotional entanglements that didn't fit neatly into the life he showed the world. He told himself that what he maintained privately harmed no one, because he managed it carefully and kept it separate from his visible commitments. Racing provided natural cover, long hours in the garage, extended travel, offering plausible explanations for absences that would otherwise raise questions. Over time the separation became routine rather than stressful. And routine can make even the most fragile arrangement feel stable. As Street Outlaws grew in popularity through the early 2020s, the stakes rose dramatically. Public scrutiny sharpened. Social media amplified tiny inconsistencies. Fans started noticing patterns that once passed without comment. Dave brushed off curiosity with practiced ease, confident that no one could piece together a story he had spent 30 years carefully editing. The racing community itself operated on loyalty and unspoken codes, which worked in his favor, because few questioned a man who delivered performance consistently. His competitors respected him. His teammates relied on him. His fans admired his grit, reinforcing the persona that had become almost inseparable from his name. Inside that persona, however, lived a quieter reality that demanded increasing effort to sustain. By 2024 subtle strain began surfacing in moments that would have once passed unnoticed. Missed calls lingered longer than they should have. Conversations carried undertones of suspicion. Small scheduling conflicts became harder to explain convincingly. Dave responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control and convincing himself that discipline could outpace exposure. What he failed to recognize was that the very qualities that made him a legend on the streets, precision, secrecy, relentless focus, were also the traits that had allowed his double life to survive undetected for 3 decades. The king of the streets had built an empire on calculated risk. Yet the greatest risk he ever took was believing that two separate realities could run parallel forever without eventually colliding. The other garage. Every racer has a place where the real work happens, a garage away from noise and distraction, where engines are stripped to their core and rebuilt with deliberate patience. For Daddy Dave there was another kind of garage, one that existed not in steel and concrete, but in secrecy and routine. A space he constructed long before fame magnified his every move. 30 years earlier, when street racing was still raw and undocumented, Dave had made a choice that seemed manageable at the time. That he formed a connection that did not fit within the life he was building publicly, convincing himself that compartmentalization was a skill rather than a gamble. What began as something temporary slowly evolved into a parallel existence that required maintenance just as careful as any high-performance engine. He learned how to divide his time with surgical precision, aligning obligations so that neither world overlapped visibly. Racing provided natural cover, late nights and out-of-town events required no elaborate explanation. The rhythm of horsepower and competition masked the rhythm of a second commitment very few suspected existed. For years the arrangement felt controlled, almost mechanical in its efficiency. He told himself that loyalty in one area did not negate responsibility in another, and that careful separation prevented harm. The longer it continued, the easier it became to believe the dual structure was sustainable indefinitely. The other garage demanded discretion and emotional discipline, and Dave provided both without hesitation. He maintained financial support quietly, ensured communication remained structured, and kept records separate from the accounts tied to his public life. Nothing was reckless, nothing impulsive. And that order reassured him he was not spiraling beyond control. As Street Outlaws propelled him into national recognition, the stakes escalated dramatically. Visibility meant vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened exposure. Yet Dave responded by tightening the system rather than dismantling it. He adjusted schedules with even greater precision, leveraging travel demands and media commitments as shields against scrutiny. There were moments when doubt surfaced, usually late at night when adrenaline had faded and the weight of secrecy settled in. He would stare at the ceiling and wonder whether the cost of maintaining both worlds would eventually exceed the benefit of preserving them. Each time he convinced himself that protecting everyone from upheaval justified continued silence. The other life was not chaotic or flamboyant. It was structured and intentional, rooted in promises made long before television cameras arrived. That structure made it harder to walk away, because ending it would mean confronting consequences he had postponed for decades. He believed that as long as he kept control, no collision would occur. But secrecy has a way of accumulating tension beneath the surface, much like pressure building inside an engine pushed beyond safe limits. In 2023 small cracks began forming as digital footprints became harder to obscure and private messages easier to trace. The world had changed, and the tools that once protected him were no longer as reliable. By early 2024 subtle inquiries reached him from unexpected directions. A bank statement questioned, a travel discrepancy noticed, a name mentioned in conversation with too much familiarity to dismiss casually. Each inquiry was minor on its own, but together they formed a pattern that tightened around him. Dave responded the way he always had when faced with threat, by accelerating rather than braking. He doubled down on appearances, intensified his focus on racing, and projected unwavering confidence in every public interaction. Yet beneath that projection anxiety simmered, because he understood that exposure would not only damage his reputation, but fracture trust in ways he could not repair easily. The most dangerous element was not the existence of the second life, but the emotional investment woven into it over 3 decades. There were people involved who had grown accustomed to his presence, expectations that had solidified over time. The other garage was no longer a side project. It was a fully built machine running parallel to the one the world applauded. In late 2024 an unexpected conversation forced him to confront how thin the wall between his worlds had become. A simple question delivered with quiet intensity carried more weight than any accusation could have. "How long has this been going on?" the voice asked, and Dave felt the air shift in a way he could not reverse. For the first time in 30 years he realized that control might have been an illusion sustained by momentum rather than certainty. The parallel tracks he had managed so meticulously were beginning to curve toward each other. The other garage, once hidden and orderly, was no longer fully contained. And the king of the streets faced a reckoning that speed alone could not outrun. The health scare and the confession. The body has a way of revealing what the mind insists on managing. And by early 2025 the strain of 30 years had begun manifesting in ways Dave could no longer dismiss as fatigue. What started as headaches and persistent insomnia escalated into moments of dizziness that struck without warning, leaving him gripping the edge of a workbench just to steady himself. He told everyone it was exhaustion from travel and racing. But privately he knew the pressure was no longer mechanical. One afternoon while tuning an engine in preparation for an upcoming race, the room tilted abruptly and his vision blurred. He tried to push through it as he always had, unwilling to show weakness in front of his crew, but his legs betrayed him and he collapsed onto a nearby stool. Concern replaced banter instantly, and within minutes he was being urged to seek medical attention whether he liked it or not. At the hospital, under harsh lighting and the hum of machines that measured more than horsepower, Dave confronted a different kind of vulnerability. Doctors spoke about stress levels, elevated blood pressure, and the cumulative impact of prolonged anxiety. They asked questions about lifestyle, about sleep, about hidden pressures, and each question felt like a spotlight moving closer to the truth he had guarded. When a physician quietly suggested that unmanaged stress could become life-altering if ignored, the warning settled into him more deeply than any rival's challenge ever had. Dave had always measured risk in seconds on a track. But this was different, because there was no finish line and no clear opponent to beat. The threat was internal, and sustained by silence. Returning home, he carried more than discharge papers. He carried the awareness that the illusion of control was eroding. The phone call that had unsettled him weeks earlier echoed louder now, because the people affected by his double life were no longer content with partial answers. Conversations that once could be postponed were now unavoidable. The confrontation happened not in anger, but in exhausted clarity. Sitting across from someone who had grown tired of secrecy, Dave heard words that pierced deeper than accusation. "I deserve the truth," they said firmly, and he understood that evasion would only compound the damage already done. He tried initially to frame the situation as complexity rather than deception, explaining how compartmentalization had felt necessary at the time decisions were made. He spoke about responsibility, about protecting stability, about avoiding upheaval that could ripple outward uncontrollably. Yet even as he spoke, he recognized how hollow those justifications sounded. After 3 decades, the confession did not unfold all at once, but in layers stripped away slowly as resistance weakened. He admitted the duration, admitted the financial and emotional ties, admitted that what began as manageable had become entrenched. With each revelation, the weight in the room intensified, because 30 years is not a minor lapse, but a parallel lifetime. Shock replaced denial quickly, followed by a silence more devastating than shouting could have been. The question of why lingered heavier than the details themselves, and Dave struggled to articulate motives that had shifted over time. He realized that what once felt like protection now resembled betrayal in the eyes of those who had trusted him completely. News of his health scare and private turmoil inevitably reached his racing circle, and whispers began circulating within the Street Outlaws community. Teammates who had admired his discipline now questioned what else had been hidden beneath that composure. Loyalty, once unquestioned, began to feel conditional in ways Dave had never experienced before. He found himself confronting the possibility that the life he built on reputation and reliability might fracture under scrutiny. The irony was sharp, because he had survived catastrophic crashes only to face potential collapse from something invisible. Speed had never frightened him. Exposure did. In the days following the confession, Dave felt stripped of the armor he had worn for decades. The double life he believed he controlled had become public within the circles that mattered most, and the health scare underscored that time was no longer a limitless resource. He understood now that postponing truth had nearly cost him more than reputation. It had threatened his well-being. The reckoning was not cinematic or explosive, but painfully human. A man who had mastered engines and outrun rivals now had to confront the consequences of choices made long ago. The confession did not erase the past, but it ended the illusion that he could continue dividing himself indefinitely. And for the first time in 30 years, Dave stood still, without an engine to drown out the sound of accountability. Fallout in the racing family. In the world of Street Outlaws, loyalty is currency, and once doubt enters the equation, even the fastest car cannot outrun its consequences. when whispers of Daddy Dave's double life began circulating among the racing crew, reactions ranged from stunned disbelief to quiet disappointment that carried more weight than open anger ever could. These were men who trusted each other at speeds where hesitation meant disaster. And trust fractured slowly when secrets surfaced. At first conversations happened in private corners of garages and parking lots, away from cameras and fans who idolized the unity of the team. Some defended him, arguing that personal life and racing performance were separate domains that should not intersect. Others questioned whether a man capable of maintaining a hidden existence for 30 years could truly be as transparent as they once believed. Dave sensed the shift immediately. Even before anyone confronted him directly, handshakes lingered a fraction of a second shorter. Jokes carried an edge they once lacked. Invitations to strategize felt less instinctive than before. The atmosphere had not turned hostile, but it had undeniably cooled. One teammate eventually approached him with a question that was direct but not cruel. "Is everything they're saying true?" the man asked quietly, and Dave recognized that deflection would only deepen suspicion. That he confirmed enough to acknowledge the reality without airing every detail. Aware that half-truths were no longer sustainable, the response was not explosive outrage, but something more complicated, disappointment mingled with empathy. Because racing culture understands pressure in ways outsiders rarely do, yet empathy did not erase the fact that a man who preaches loyalty must embody it consistently, and that standard now hung heavily over Dave's reputation. Beyond the crew, fans began speculating online, analyzing past interviews and appearances for signs they had overlooked. Social media amplified every rumor, turning personal turmoil into public debate. For a figure accustomed to controlling his narrative through performance, the loss of that control felt destabilizing. Sponsors and business partners watched closely, measuring risk not in emotional terms but in brand stability. Dave found himself fielding careful inquiries about future commitments, each conversation layered with caution. The empire he built on reliability now stood under quiet review. At home, the strain intensified as consequences became tangible rather than theoretical. Difficult conversations replaced routine comfort, and accountability required more than apologies. He understood that rebuilding trust would demand patience and transparency he had avoided for decades. Within the racing family, some bonds held firm, strengthened perhaps by the honesty that followed exposure. Others loosened subtly, not severed entirely, but altered in tone and expectation. The dynamic had shifted from unquestioned confidence to cautious recalibration. Dave faced the humbling realization that speed and skill could not repair emotional fractures. He had spent his life solving problems with precision and discipline. Yet this situation required vulnerability rather than strategy. The fallout was not immediate ruin, but it was unmistakable transformation. As weeks passed, the intensity of speculation gradually softened, replaced by the slower work of repair. Dave continued racing, showing up consistently and refusing to retreat from the track that defined him. Still, each launch down the strip carried an added weight. Because reputation once cracked never returns to its original shape. The racing family did not abandon him, but neither did they pretend nothing had changed. Loyalty remained, yet it was now paired with awareness that even legends are capable of secrecy. For the first time in his career, Daddy Dave felt the vulnerability of standing among peers who knew the full weight of his truth, and that vulnerability marked a turning point more profound than any checkered flag. The man behind the wheel. When the noise finally settled and the speculation thinned into something quieter and more manageable, Daddy Dave found himself facing a reality he had postponed for 30 years. There were no engines roaring, no rivals lined up beside him, no cameras dictating posture or tone. There was only the aftermath of truth, and the question of who he intended to be without the protection of division. For decades he had defined himself by performance, measuring worth in wins, recoveries, and the ability to endure pressure without visible strain. Now endurance required something entirely different. Because rebuilding trust demanded consistency over spectacle and humility over dominance, the man who once controlled every variable on a track had to accept that not everything could be tuned back into alignment with a wrench and enough patience. The first step was transparency. Not in dramatic public declarations but in private commitments that restructured how he lived daily life. He opened conversations he once avoided, answered questions fully rather than partially, and resisted the instinct to minimize discomfort for the sake of short-term peace. Each exchange felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground where speed offered no advantage. He acknowledged openly that fear had driven many of his choices: fear of destabilizing the family structure, fear of losing respect, fear of confronting consequences he could not predict, admitting that fear did not diminish him as he once believed. Instead, it revealed the vulnerability he had spent years disguising as composure. That admission altered the dynamic between him and those closest to him more than any apology could have done alone. In the racing world he adopted a similar posture of quiet accountability. He did not overshare details, but he stopped evading the topic entirely when asked directly. Teammates observed the shift and responded cautiously at first, measuring whether this new openness was sustainable or temporary. Over time, consistency replaced skepticism, because he continued showing up without defensiveness or denial. Physically, he took his health scare seriously rather than treating it as a temporary inconvenience. Regular checkups, lifestyle adjustments, and a deliberate effort to manage stress became part of his routine. The discipline he once applied exclusively to engines he now applied to his well-being, recognizing that strength without balance was no longer an option. Emotionally, the process proved slower and more complex. Trust that fractures over decades does not rebuild in weeks, and Dave accepted that some relationships might never return to their original form. Acceptance became its own form of growth, because he understood that consequences are not always reversible even when intention shifts. There were moments when regret surfaced sharply, especially when reflecting on milestones he experienced in divided fashion. He questioned how different his life might have been had he chosen honesty earlier, yet he resisted dwelling in hypothetical timelines that could not alter present reality. Instead, he focused on what could still be preserved and strengthened. By late 2025, the narrative surrounding him had evolved from scandal to scrutiny to cautious respect. He was no longer viewed as untouchable, but as human, flawed, and accountable. That shift unsettled him initially, because invincibility had been a shield, yet over time he discovered that humanity fostered deeper connection than legend ever could. In a quiet conversation with someone who had endured the fallout alongside him, he was asked whether he believed the cost had been worth it. He paused thoughtfully before answering that truth rarely feels convenient, but it is lighter to carry than secrecy sustained for decades. The response was not triumphant, but grounded in hard-earned clarity. The double life that once required constant maintenance had dissolved into a singular existence defined by alignment rather than division. He remained a racer, still competitive and still driven by the thrill of acceleration, yet the identity behind the wheel no longer depended on concealment. The garage that once housed two realities now contained only one, and that simplicity felt unfamiliar but steady. Dave did not emerge from the revelation unchanged, nor did he reclaim the untarnished image he once projected effortlessly. What he gained instead was coherence, the ability to stand in any room without calculating which version of himself needed to appear. For a man who built his life on mastering motion, learning to stand still in truth became his most profound victory. The legend of the streets endured, but it was reshaped by transparency and tempered by humility. The roar of engines still echoed through his life, yet it no longer masked internal conflict. In the end, the greatest race he ever faced was not against rivals under bright lights, but against the weight of his own secrecy, and crossing that finish line required courage no stopwatch could measure. For 3 decades Dave outran rivals, wrecks, and doubt. But the one thing he could never truly outrun was the truth he carried in silence. His story is not just about racing, reputation, or horsepower. It is about the hidden weight of divided loyalty, and the emotional cost of maintaining two realities for 30 years. The crashes we see on asphalt are dramatic, but the quiet collisions inside a man can be even more devastating. Legends are not defined by perfection, but by how they respond when everything threatens to collapse beneath them. Daddy Dave's greatest race was never under stadium lights, but in the stillness where accountability replaced acceleration. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe redemption is earned on the track, or through honesty when the engines go quiet? Share your thoughts below and join the conversation.